Sunday Baroque Conversations is made possible by the Friends of Sunday Baroque and is produced at WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm Suzanne Bona. Thank you for listening. Don't miss an episode of Sunday Baroque Conversations. Subscribe on Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a review. If you want to find out where you can listen to our weekly show, visit our website, sundaybaroque.org, for a station list and our 24/7 stream. Again, that's sundaybaroque.org. South Carolina native Kellen Gray is assistant conductor of the English National Opera and associate artist of the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. He was formerly also the associate conductor of the Charleston Symphony and assistant conductor of Chicago Sinfonietta and the Valdosta Symphony Orchestra. The Scotland-based American conductor has a reputation as a versatile and imaginative artist through his diverse array of traditional and experimental programming and multimedia concert presentations. Conductor Kellen Gray joins me on Zoom to talk about his life in music. Thank you so very much. It's such a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be with you. I'm just really excited to sit down and chat for a little bit.
Fantastic. Let's go right back to the beginning, though. Let's talk about how you got started in music and, whether you're from a musical family.
Yeah, I'm not from a traditional musical family like a lot of musicians are. I mean, my father was a singer. It was his major in college, but that's not what he chose to do as a profession. In fact, he got into football. He's a football coach in South Carolina still to this day, and a teacher. In fact, both of my parents are teachers. But he's the only other person in my family that's a trained musician or even reads music. But I was, if you think about an extended family in a sense of maybe community, I was sort of raised around music all the time. I mean, it was just sort of always surrounding me, whether it was at church, singing in the choir, which he directed one of the choirs when I was a kid, but he was often the only person that read music in the entire church, or, singing on the playground or digging through my parents' record collection and putting on everything from Paganini and Beethoven to Barry White and the Isley Brothers. Music was just sort of always around, and it sort of really made up who I am as a musician today. In so many cases, I really view so many different styles of music as being equal, and that's kind of how I was introduced to music as a young child. Everything from classical to country to bluegrass to soul to hip hop, everything sort of all at once, and kind of this one big I guess what's the best way to describe it? Maybe sort of this just big patchwork or big quilt of different musical styles.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they say, the more you love music, the more music you love, right?
Exactly.
So did you start off playing an instrument, or was it truly just singing through your musical early years?
It was just singing and snapping and clapping and doing all this sort of folk singing styles and dances that are sort of native to South Carolina, until I was in middle school, when we sort of in the public school system, they really had all of us do all the electives, everything from wood shop to strings to chorus. And so I had to address that in the sixth grade. And that was the first time I actually touched a classical instrument, any one of them. And they have this little test for us where you had to try every instrument, and they give you a rating like 1 through 5, 1 being the highest, 5 being the lowest, and I ended up getting a 1 on all of them. And it kind of hit me at a pivotal time in my life. Growing up in a house with a football coach, I played football, American football, that is, I guess I should say. And in fact, the city that I'm from, Rock Hill, South Carolina, is called Football City, USA. Literally, its national title, because it produces more NFL players than any other city, sort of poor population.
Wow.
And around that time in the sixth grade, I was all of maybe 4'10", and maybe 4'9" even. And so everybody else was getting bigger and I wasn't. And so my value on the football field was diminishing quickly. And suddenly when you put an instrument in my hand, I was good at something again. And I think, for all the reasons that we all did music, we find our community there. So I was good at something again. I was suddenly on a team again, and everybody's winning all the time and finding a community. And it just really felt like a place for me.
Wow, that's amazing. How tall are you now?
I think I'm all of about 5'9" on a good day.
So you grew some.
Yes, I did. In my concert shoes, I'm 5'9".
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Perfect. So was it kind of at that moment that you really understood that music is really, your calling? Was it that early that you realized that?
Not really. I wish I did at the time. Maybe I would have invested in it more seriously a little sooner. At the time, honestly, I wanted to be a. This is going to be hilarious. I wanted to be a paleontologist or herpetologist. In
Wow.
fact, my whole plan was I was going to South Carolina State University to study biology. I was planning to walk on the golf team, and then study biology so I could do paleontology or herpetology, and maybe one day be good enough to be a professional golfer. If but I in my senior year of high school, I believe it was about halfway through, I started doing some thinking. And I was like, I really don't like to do math. And you can't really be a scientist if you don't like to do math. It's like, well, what do I want to do like every day for the rest of my life? And
Mm.
it's play the violin was what I thought of. And by
Uh-huh.
that point, I'd actually started taking lessons as a junior in high school, like mowing lawns and working. In fact, I've been working since I was like 12 years old. I'm not sure if it was legal, but I've been literally working to some degree since then. And I used to work and save my money to take violin lessons when a particular violin teacher moved to town in my junior year. And and then by the time my
Oh.
senior year came around, my father reconnected me or connected me with one of his professors that he actually studied with in college, Mr. Leroy Sellers, who was a violinist in the Charlotte Symphony in the 60s. In fact, he's one of the two musicians that simultaneously integrated the Charlotte Symphony at that time.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so he became my violin teacher and pushed me really hard. In fact, I quit sports totally and put all of my focus into learning the violin. He had me up at 5 a.m every morning before school practicing. And since I didn't have to go to wrestling practice or football practice anymore, I was practicing after school and just dedicated all of my time to becoming the best violinist I could so I could get into college. And I did so. And that's sort of what got me into classical music seriously.
Wow, that's inspiring. So you were not the kid that needed to be hounded to practice, which is really very telling.
No, I actually wished my parents, I wished my parents at the time had pushed me and hound me to practice but it all came from me. And
Yeah.
now I'm glad I did not have that. I understand
Right.
how unhealthy that is now, but
Yeah. Right. Right.
so I feel very fortunate that I grew up sort of in the way that I did, that they actually were trying to
Right.
slow me down and trying to get me to live life a little bit.
Right. That's wise counsel for anyone who excels that young at anything, whether it's music or whatever. So Leroy Sellers was that a very important pivotal teacher. Who are some of your other important teachers and mentors, and how did they influence your career?
Oh gosh, well I have to, have to, in that case, have to give a big shout out to Dr. Jacob Dakin, who's I believe now is a professor at University of Kansas or Kansas University. Forgive me, I forget in which order they lie. He was the one who started me on the violin there, at least in private study.
Mhm.
And Emily Thompson from the Rock Hill School District, who was
Oh.
the teacher that introduced me to the violin in the sixth grade, and
Hmm.
she was my strings teacher, sixth through eighth grade. We sort of got to reunite a couple of years ago when I came home to guest conduct the Rock Hill Symphony, and she was in attendance, and so it was really good to see her for the first time since I was an eighth grader. And I have to, be incredibly thankful to Dr. Howard Shue, who I studied with in my master's degree. He's the one who started me in conducting.
Hmm.
I had a degree before becoming. I'm sorry, I had a profession before becoming a conductor as being a violinist, and I played for many years and got a little burned out and took a break before I got into conducting. And I reached out to Howard because I used to play in his orchestra as a freelancer and asked him if he'd be willing to train me as a conductor or just give me a couple lessons. And he agreed to give me a couple lessons. And then when he needed a new assistant conductor, asked me if I'd be willing to come on and work for him. So it's sort of my first big break to get my degree and a position. And May Ann Chen, who's the music director at Chicago Sinfonietta, who took me on as a fellow, and the Charleston Symphony gave me a job after that as assistant conductor. And music director Thomas Sonnegaard at the RSNO has been an incredible, life-changing mentor, just as Mayan Chen was. And I'm just so thankful to all of them for sort of allowing me to be under their wing a bit and learn the industry and learn to be a better conductor and a better musician.
Wow, wow. Well, you sort of preempted my next question, which was how did you begin conducting? But so let's dig a little bit beneath the surface on that. So when you were conducting, obviously you had quite a stellar lineup of mentors and teachers there that you've just listed as conducting mentors as well. But so at what point did you realize like, it's not going to be the violin, it's really going to be conducting? Because just a moment ago you said what I want to do every day for the rest of my life is to play violin. So you sort of
Mhm.
have shifted now. When did that happen and how?
Oh gosh, I think it was an evolution that I was never really aware of until it was far
Oh.
too late. At some point in my undergrad, well, I say this, the first symphony I ever played, true symphony I played was in college. My violin professor at the time, Pat Kobos, was conducting the orchestra, and I guess he was in a lot of ways my sort of my first inspiration for even thinking of conducting. So we began the beginning, the opening of Brahms Symphony Number One, big C minor, and the timpani is pounding and the strings are playing this sostenuto syncopations, and I just remember thinking as we were playing, wow, it must be amazing to conduct this, and not even thinking about playing it. I mean, I was having a marvelous time playing it, but seeing him enjoy conducting it just made me sort of think of it, and immediately the thought passed. And maybe by the time my senior year came around, the local regional conductor of the Columbus Symphony. I went to Columbus State University in Columbus, Georgia. His name was George Dolgovo, was their conductor, and he became our orchestra conductor for that last year that I was there. And I ended up having to take his basic conducting course. And he asked if anyone had any conducting aspirations. And at that time, I was sort of thinking about what are other things I might want to do other than play the violin, as much as I was loving it. He just, thinking about diversifying my skill set aside from just being in the practice room 6 hours a day. Um, and it suddenly hit me. I was like, oh, well, that could be fun. And I creepily raised my hand up, and his reply to that was, we'll see if we can talk you out of that. Since I was the only person to raise my hand. But again, I sort of dismissed it. Um, and as I mentioned, I took a little bit of a break from professional violin playing many years later as a full grown adult out there in the world, making my money as a violinist in particular orchestras, but also many orchestras up and down the East Coast. And when it was time to come back to music, I sort of started to think to myself, what are the things that I love to do, and what might I want to do other than just get another degree in violin? Like from my adventures not in music, which ranged everything from bartending to beekeeping, I knew that I wanted to do something where I had sort of a community presence and be able to help people and work in the community. I knew I still wanted to perform. Um, I wanted to be able to study works from a more holistic place than just learning the violin part. And it suddenly hit me that conducting was all those things. And so I reached out to Howard Chu at the Valdosta Symphony to ask if he might be willing to train me. And he, as I mentioned, he sort of reached out to me quickly and was like, "My assistant has to move back to Korea. Can you come study with me now and be my graduate
Wow.
assistant?" And so I was really grateful for that opportunity, and I hurried to grab it because one doesn't really get to sort of walk into an opportunity like that.
Hmm.
That being said, I was terrified because I had no experience, and I didn't really just decide to be a conductor. I guess I just figured all beginning conductors are terrible. I'll just be terrible at it until I'm not. Um, and so I went down that journey, and luckily I've been able to fool people ever since that I actually know what I'm doing. So
Wow.
it's really just been a continuous journey, I think.
Wow, that's also very inspiring. I think many people, including people who are, very well steeped in the world of orchestral music as audience members, I think even those people have no idea of everything a conductor does before the concert. Let's not even get into what a music director does, but a conductor. So how do you see your so what is that? And then also how do you personally see your role when you're working with an orchestra?
I see my role when I'm working with an orchestra in I guess a couple different ways I might be able to portray it. I see myself as a thermostat for the room in a lot of
Mm.
ways. I can't expect the musicians to be or do anything that I'm not already doing. I guess maybe a really applicable example is you can't really yell at an orchestra and ask them to play Dolce. It just doesn't really happen. To ask them to play nicely and sweetly and beautifully and gently.
Mhm.
And you have to count that, musicians are coming from all over parts of town, maybe even from out of town, driving in. We all have to get settled. And I think, if I come in calm, collected, in the mood of the music that we're hoping to achieve here, I think it sort of sets a tone
Mhm.
for the music that we're about to inhabit or make more alive, I guess, or make it escape the page. Um, and also I see myself, and I guess this is going back to my whole beekeeping thing. I see one of the reasons I got into conducting, or one of the things that sort of changed my view that allowed me to conduct, was my adventures in beekeeping. I see an amazing parallel between beekeepers and conductors.
Mm.
When I was beekeeping, I guess I'll put it this way: a beehive is a self-governing superorganism. Every bee has, or at least every worker bee, has a role that changes throughout its lifetime. If you may be a sort
Mm.
of custodial bee, a guardian bee, a collector of nectar, a scout bee, so on and so forth. And it's the same thing in an orchestra. We change roles throughout the life of the piece. Many times you play the melody, the accompaniment, you play a supporting line, something that's more in the distance, something that's more in the foreground. And we change roles throughout in this very, very organic way.
Hmm.
And just like for the hive, the beekeeper basically just does a few things that helps make the lives easier of the worker bees. For example, you might tilt your hive down just a little bit so the custodial bees, when they roll the balls of lint out, it sort of goes out a little bit easier. And for a conductor, you facilitate things that are a little difficult to do across the orchestra, maybe for the violins and the trumpets that are 50 feet apart from each other,
Hmm.
so on and so forth. And so it's you have this incredible orchestra in front of you, this group of 70 to 100 amazingly trained musicians that can do it without you, frankly. But you're there to sort of just either make things easier or bring something to the table that can't be done without a conductor there.
Wow, wow. So there really is really when you're performing, that's sort of that's the tip of the iceberg, really.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The performance is the tip of the iceberg. So much of it happens in rehearsal, where we're really having the conversation, both nonverbal communication and verbal communication about what should happen in the piece. Hopefully, bringing some inspiration to the table or perspective that one may not have. For example, I champion often the music of African American composers so much of the time because the music is usually based on music that I grew up with. You take composers like William Grant Still, Florence Price, William Dawson, Ulysses Kay, Margaret Bonds. They're often made of early African American folk music, field hollers, jubas, spirituals, cakewalks, so on and so forth. And I was lucky enough to be born in South Carolina, where all those things are sort of preserved in a lot of ways,
Mhm.
especially in the Gullah regions of the southern states.
Mhm.
And often, because our orchestras are not the most yet diverse places, we're often not made up of individuals that are from these cultures and understand the significance of these particular cultural styles or patchworks. So I personally champion that, just as we spend so much time and so much effort to make a distinction between waltz and Lendler when we're playing a Mahler symphony, we do
Mhm.
the same when it comes to Juba and Cakewalk, when it comes to
Mm.
a Florence Price symphony. And again, because we're not necessarily made up of musicians that are from these backgrounds, that insight that I bring to the table of exactly how a Juba should sound, how a Cakewalk should sound, how we make that happen from time, tone, articulation, vibrato, and dynamic is really what brings it to the surface. And all that happens in the
Mhm.
rehearsal. And then everything you see in the performance that I'm doing with my hands is really just sort of reminding the musicians of what we did in the rehearsal.
Wow, wow. I'm so glad you brought up some of those composers. And because my next question, I really would love for you to talk more about your two recordings, your 2022, I believe, debut album, African American Voices. That's with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. And that was music by William Grant Still and William Dawson. And then you followed it up in October 2023 with African American Voices 2, and that's Margaret Bonds, Ulysses Kay, and Coleridge Taylor Perkinson. Some really beautiful and amazing and really important works on both of these recordings. I'd love for you to just talk about them, how they came about, how you chose this music, and talk a little bit about these pieces and why they're so important, not only to you, but why they're just important in the canon.
Sure, sure. So at first, I have to give credit to the Royal Scottish National Orchestra and our leader, our chief executive, Alistair Mackey, and our music director, Thomas Sonnergaard, for wanting to take on these projects.
Hmm.
Not many orchestras allow their assistant conductors to create commercial recordings. In fact, I'm the only the only assistant conductor that I know of that's been sort of, I guess, been privileged with that responsibility.
Yeah.
But Alistair and I were at lunch one day, and we were speaking of George Walker, and he was curious as to why he hasn't heard many recordings. There are some, but not many recordings of George Walker's works from major orchestras, and asked me if I would be interested to record a couple of them. And so we decided to sort of move forward with this project and sought the advice from all parts of our organization and some outside of our organization, and ultimately decided we might be able to do something a bit more broad. And they just frankly asked me what I think would be the most impactful project possible. And I told them that I think we should go back to the beginning. I think there are a number of recordings of William Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony and William Grant's Still's Afro American Symphony, which are the first two symphonies published by African American composers. But frankly, they've never been recorded by the combination of an African American composer or conductor and a major orchestra. that's only significant because that means there hasn't been a conductor that's been of the culture to actually record these works.
Mm-hmm.
At least not with a major orchestra, an orchestra that's going to be, the Ferrari of orchestras, to be able to do it to its highest possible level.
Mm-hmm.
Ferrari or Lamborghini, whatever might be your choice. But again, and one might say, like, why is that significant? I think we often really we focus on hiring German and Austrian conductors to do Mahler and Beethoven, and French conductors to do Debussy, because they're often of the culture. And myself, growing up in, frankly, the rural parts of South Carolina, I did all these jubas and cakewalks and call and response spirituals, and literally all the things that make up these symphonies are my musical heritage. And so I take a lot of pride in bringing them out and trying to illuminate them as brightly as possible. And so the RSNO was open enough to take on this sort of 2-year exploration in African American folk music performance practice, and really learn the original origins of these particular folk styles, and learn how they're sort of set in the symphonies and really take them on. So we started with William Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony and William Grant Still Afro-American Symphony #1, two really, really incredible works written almost simultaneously, and really went after so many of the folk elements that lie within. I just find them to be two of my absolute favorite composers, William Dawson being known more in his time as a vocal composer. He wrote lots of works for chorus and singular voice. Some of them have piano or orchestral accompaniment, not many of them, but this is his only symphony that he wrote. And it's a programmatic symphony based from a singular motive that you hear in the first couple bars, that he calls the missing link of humanity when we decided to enslave each other. It's a really, really moving 3-movement symphony that I think the heart of it is in the second movement, called Hope in the Night, but one could really call it sort of despair of the day, considering its subject matter. But I'll leave you to listen to the album for that. And Grant Still's Afro-American Symphony, one might, I guess the uninitiated might listen to it and see it simply as a jazz symphony, but it's really a palette of all the pre-jazz era sort of dance forms and all the other folk styles that we mentioned. Everything from blues, stride, jazz in and of itself, rag, the dance forms like juba and cakewalk, so on and so forth. And I think you'll really find that we put a lot of effort into illuminating all those different things. And then in the second album, you see some sort of musical descendants of those two composers, and Margaret Bonds, who actually studied with William Dawson, and Ulysses Kay, who was a student of Paul Hindemith, and Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, who's a really unique bird, who's a combination of a jazz musician and a classical musician equally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is a little bit of a jumping off point from that, from those two recordings, to your role when you were conductor of the Charleston Symphony. You established, I believe you personally established Project Aurora. And
Yes.
I'd love for you to talk about Project Aurora and really more broadly what you think other musicians, ensembles, arts institutions can and should be doing to join you in championing these composers and these musicians.
Yes. So when I was with the Charleston Symphony, we undertook a project, as you mentioned, called Project Aurora. It's really based on the work and piggybacking on the work of a coterie of African American composers or composers and writers that were based in Charleston, South Carolina,
Mhm.
known as the Aurorian Coterie. All of them were based at the Avery Institute. Effectively, they were the music faculty and literature faculty of the Avery Institute in Charleston, South Carolina, which at the time in the early 20th century and late 19th century was the only Black secondary school in South Carolina. Many of these composers and writers were incredibly, incredibly well accomplished, both respectively and as a coterie. Some of them would have been Harlem Renaissance collaborators, literally writing songs whose libretto would have been made from Langston Hughes' poetry, or original poetry, original words written by Langston Hughes himself, and used within these songs. Together, they brought in artists such as Roland Hayes and Marian Anderson to Charleston to put on recitals and what they called entertainments of music, or entertainments of literature and music, where they might have these sort of salon-like events within within Black churches. The confines of those churches are within the brick and mortar as its sort of venues. Many of their projects and salons and concerts would have been actually documented in the Charleston Messenger, the Black newspaper at the time, or also sent to the New York Age. In fact, there's a couple really wonderful articles written in the New York Age using the Aurorian Coterie's work as an example of of what could be done in African American arts and culture around the time, the late 19th century, early 20th century. At the time, the moniker would have been known as the New Negro, and so that's what is the art of the New Negro at the time. Obviously, we don't use that term these days. But considering the evolution from whence it came, it was a novel concept.
Mm-hmm.
So at the Charleston Symphony, we decided we wanted to continue that work. So we obviously, so much of Charleston's musical history is the sort of the cradle of American music. So many of the roots of jazz come from Charleston and of itself, and particularly from the Jenkins Orphanage, the work of Nathaniel Jenkins and him starting the Jenkins Orphanage Band, which became world famous. And so much of its alumni are the greatest jazz musicians that the country's ever birthed, like Freddie Green and Cat Anderson, so on and so forth. Google it, you will find innumerable list of names that have been incredible jazz influencers, Jabbo Smith, so on and so forth. Um, and so we decided that we wanted to undertake so much of the music that is of Charleston that created America's music. So all the composers that you think of that might be associated with Gershwin, but who are the composers that Gershwin like pulled from? It would have been the James, I'm sorry, not the James, with James P. Johnson, yes, but it also would have been the Edmund Thornton Jenkins, who was a Charleston native, the influence from the Jenkins Orphanage Band, all the people and folk musicians he would have heard when he's writing Porgy and Bess in Charleston. So, who are the composers basically that are championing African American folk idioms as the basis of their work? So, we're talking pre-jazz era dance forms, the jubas, the cakewalks, spirituals, blues, bebop, so on and so forth. And what are the classical composers that champion that? And so we decided to actually transmogrify Charleston's musical identity or regional identity into its musical identity by putting those into our masterwork season, our pop season, chamber music season, and make it sort of just an organic part of our musical programming.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that any orchestra can do that. I think if you look at your regional identity and see who you are, there's a way to turn it into your musical identity.
Mm-hmm. This also gets into a little bit the concept of, for lack of a better way of putting it, musical genres.
Mhm.
We've sort of pigeonholed different genres. Classical music is this, and I
Yes.
don't know if that's necessarily really true. And it's sort of like saying, you know, clothing. There's clothing, but this
Mhm.
is a shirt. This is not clothing. This is a shirt.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think we've sort of come to this point where we're realizing that it's not always an either or. That music, is there something really separate and distinctive or different about classical music that is mutually exclusive from other kinds? And I love the way that you're really illustrating that there's a lot more in common and a lot more overlap than there is separateness.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've been genre bending for a long time. We've just not necessarily called it that, or we've made the exceptions for which were socially acceptable at the time.
Right.
For example, I think when we think about George Gershwin, even during his day, it was not your typical quote unquote classical music like we would have necessarily considered
Right.
for even a composer as progressive as Igor Stravinsky or Rachmaninoff
Mm-hmm.
or Beethoven, but we very much accepted it because of who Gershwin was at the time and who our
Right.
classical music audiences were. So I think that we allowed our imaginations to have music that's much more similar to jazz to be
Mm-hmm.
considered classical music because of the person who was delivering it.
Right.
I think now we're willing to broaden that base and that sort of reference frame of basis to where it doesn't necessarily have to be delivered by a person that looks like us. And I say that in the time that people that looked like Gershwin were
Right.
often the times the ones that were in the concert hall.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're right. There's much more of a way that we can blend these sort of styles. In fact, I like to think of it more as orchestral music than classical music,
Mm.
because there's so many other styles that can be encompassed, whether it's jazz, whether it's folk music. I mean, wonderful folk musicians like Mark O'Connor are performing with orchestras, Bella Fleck, Anushka Shankar. Obviously, Wynton Marsalis just recently wrote a really, really wonderful violin concerto that encompasses both jazz, African American folk music, and Scottish folk music, which I just find to be a marvelous combination. Um, so I think there's no limit to what we can actually achieve with an actual symphony orchestra. It's just a matter of what music we're willing to put in our concert halls.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I also want to just double back a little bit to your comment when you're talking about your two recordings and the fact that not only is it someone who has this culture, represents this culture, but also, and this is to me also as a radio broadcaster, one of the really important points is a top tier orchestra doing it.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
I really feel as though that is what lots and lots of performers of, even chamber music and soloists and whatnot, playing this music, if we can have recordings of it and concert performances of it by the top tier musicians, the big names and the most talented people, that makes all the difference in the world because, everybody wants to hear the best. When you fish in the
Yes.
biggest possible pond, you get the true excellence.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm so again so grateful to the RSNO for being willing to do so. In fact, fun story about my origins of beginning as a classical musician. When I was in high school, I used to go to the record store and buy albums, and I always bought three orchestras because I knew the quality was going to be marvelous: the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Cleveland Orchestra, and the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. And of course, the RSNO has such an illustrious history of recordings with Nema Järvi and the many music directors we've had in the past. So for them to be willing to broaden their perspective, to actually bring in this music and music that's not even of their culture, I think is really significant. And so I would challenge every major orchestra out there to be willing to do so, particularly our American orchestras. I mean, African American music is American music. So hopefully, with the 250th anniversary of the United States coming up pretty soon, we're not just only celebrating Copland and Gershwin, but hopefully we'll be celebrating William Grant Still, and William Dawson and Florence Price and Margaret Bonds, and in our major orchestras, our top tier orchestras.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, what else are you passionate about? Musical or otherwise? What makes you tick?
Oh gosh, what makes me tick? If I can, when I'm not studying scores, and I'm quite booked this year, luckily, so I don't have a lot of time to do it. I love to hike. I love to camp, so I spend as much time in the forest as I possibly can, or just out in nature. In my more in shape days, I love to jog quite a bit. I don't have a dog anymore, sadly. If I did, I would really enjoy walks with my dog. But anything that I can do outdoors is really, quite frankly, what I'm passionate about.
Oh, wow. And that really is very different from being in a practice room or being in a concert hall working with an orchestra. That's great.
Absolutely,
Wonderful.
absolutely.
Well, I have been speaking on Zoom with Scotland-based American conductor Kellen Gray, who is with the English National Opera and the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. Thank you so very much for joining me. This has been just terrific.
Oh, thank you. It's really been a joy to sit with you for a bit.